In 1868, a sensational scandal broke out in Victorian society, involving one of the foremost English families, some peers of the realm, and, it was rumoured, a member of the royal family. It centred around Lady Harriet Mordaunt and the sensational divorce from her baronet husband, who was also the local MP. Her fall from grace was extreme and left her ostracised from society for the rest of her life, something that she never recovered from. It's a story of lies and deception, and illustrates the lengths that aristocracy would go to in order to cover up their indiscretions. Harriet Moncrieff was born on the 7th of February 1848. Her parents were Sir Thomas Moncrieff, the 7th Baronet of Moncrieff House in Perthshire, and his wife Louisa, with Harriet being the 4th oldest. The atmosphere at Moncrieff has been described as free and easy. During her childhood, Harriet was acquainted with Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and after his marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863, attended informal parties, including dances at Abergeldy Castle near Balmoral, which the prince used as his Highland home. In November 1865, she was invited to Sandringham, the Wales' house in Norfolk, and subsequently joined the Prince and Princess on various occasions in London. She grew up to be pretty and flirtatious, but also headstrong and, ultimately, what was said at the time to be rather unbalanced. On the 6th of December 1866, at the age of 18, she married Sir Charles Mordaunt, 10th Baronet, who was 12 years older than his bride, at St John's Episcopal Church in Perth. Sir Charles was Conservative MP for the constituency of South Warwickshire, and after a brief honeymoon, the couple lived at 72-bedroom newly refurbished Walton Hall that had been in Sir Charles's family for generations. They also had a residence in fashionable Belgrave Square in London. Sir Charles was more at home hunting and fishing than attending the society parties his wife preferred. As a stipulation of their engagement, Harriet made her future husband promise he would never impede her fun with her friends. The Mordaunts remained part of the so-called Marlborough House set of aristocratic elites who were associated socially with the Prince and Princess of Wales. According to contemporary reports, Sir Charles made a handsome settlement on his wife at the time of their marriage, and initially they appeared to live happily together. As time passed, it became clear that Lady Mordaunt was in the habit of entertaining male guests alone, while her husband was absent on parliamentary business or engaged in his various sporting activities. The Mordaunts had travelled together in Europe in the early part of their marriage, but when in June 1868 Sir Charles prepared for his annual fishing trip to Norway, Harriet encouraged him to go on his own. It was agreed that she would remain at Walton Hall with one of her sisters, who was visiting. When Sir Charles returned early from Norway, he found that his wife was alone, with no house guests in sight. One of her maids later testified that during Sir Charles's absence, Harriet had visited London where she met Viscount Cole, who had after dinner remained alone with her until a very late hour. On another occasion, he had travelled with her by train from Paddington Station to Reading, where they had occupied a carriage of which they had been the only occupants. Other servants, who seemed to have resented Harriet's behaviour, added their own accounts of Lord Cole's visits. Rumours swirled around the household in Warwickshire. Parliament rose on the 28th of July 1868, and in November Sir Charles did not stand for re-election. By then, his wife was 5 months pregnant. On the 28th of February the following year, she gave birth to a daughter called Violet. Many assumed the baby was born prematurely. The timing was significant, in view of Sir Charles's absence 9 months earlier on a fishing trip the previous year. Doctors initially feared that the child might be blind, causing Harriet to become completely hysterical at the news, imagining that this had been brought about by a hereditary sexually transmitted disease. At the time, gossip surrounded one of the Mordaunt's friends called Freddie Johnson, who was also a close confidant of the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII, whom Harriet at a later date claimed to have been one of her lovers, and that he suffered from the disease. Violet's eye infection was successfully treated, and no venereal infection was found in either mother or child. Following this episode, it would have been better for her ladyship if she'd stopped there, but she didn't. She went on to admit to her husband she'd been unfaithful to him during his absence with at least 4 other men. "Charlie, I have deceived you. The child is not yours. It's Lord Cole's," she said. Violet, she told him, wasn't his. She believed the child's father was a viscount named Lowry Cole. She further claimed to have committed adultery with Lord Cole, Sir Frederick Johnson, the Prince of Wales, and others. As one observer put it, the ensuing scandal was immense. This might well have been scandal enough, but when Harriet named Queen Victoria's son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, as one of the men she'd been with, scandal turned to media frenzy. Now, the royal family was involved. At first, Sir Charles didn't believe his wife. She had endured a difficult birth and was naturally overwrought. But after Harriet's repeated entreaties, Sir Charles was left with no other choice other than to accept what she had told him. He immediately filed for divorce. He had forced the drawer of his wife's writing desk and found a number of letters to her from the Prince of Wales. It was plainly unwise for the Prince to have written these, and, throughout his life, he seems to have had trouble resisting such communications with women he admired. However, their content, though very similar to the sort of things he wrote some years later to his mistress, Alice Keppel, were innocuous. When published later in provincial newspapers and the Times, they were judged to be simple, gossipy, everyday letters. A biographer of the actress Lily Langtry, another of the Prince's mistresses, noted that typical lines to Harriet might have come from a benevolent uncle. There is a story of Sir Charles's return to Walton Hall to find his wife in the company of the Prince and 2 white ponies, which, following the Prince's expulsion from the premises, he had shot in her presence. Although Sir Charles had acted very bitterly towards the Prince, he did not cite him in any legal action, and so formal contemporaneous accounts of Lady Mordaunt's activities tend to skirt around such events. Sir Charles started divorce proceedings on the 20th of April 1869. In view of her nervous and erratic behaviour following Violet's birth, of which full details were given by her servants, Harriet's family claimed that she was insane and unfit to plead. A counter-affidavit on behalf of St. Charles maintained she was feigning a mental disorder. On the 30th of July, Sir Thomas Moncrieff, acting as his daughter's guardian, filed an immediate counter-petition. If the defence could prove Harriet was mad, Sir Charles could not by law divorce his wife by reason of insanity, and it was formally alleged that at the time the summons was served that she was not of sound mind. Unsurprisingly, Sir Charles was having none of it. The resulting much publicised case came up for trial before Lord Penzance in the Court for Divorce and Matrimonial Causes on the 23rd of February 1870, and servants, doctors, and the men Harriet had named were all required to testify. Having been summoned to appear as a witness, the Prince of Wales was quizzed for just 7 minutes by the barristers, the first time a Prince of Wales had given evidence in open court. While admitting visits to Harriet while her husband was away, unsurprisingly, he denied anything improper had happened between them, although he did admit to spending time with her alone when Sir Charles wasn't home. Even so, the legal counsel on both sides treated the prince with kid gloves. Sir Charles's counsel, William Ballantyne, didn't even cross-examine him. After 7 days, and including evidence from a psychiatrist, the jury determined that Lady Mordaunt was suffering from what they termed as perpetual mania at the time the summons was served on her, and that she was unable to instruct a lawyer in her defence. Her symptoms were generally understood to include hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. So Harriet was ruled mentally unstable and couldn't testify in her own defence. Sir Charles's petition for divorce was dropped, and Harriet was perhaps conveniently committed to an asylum. Sir Charles, however, didn't give up. Several years and legal appeals later, the case was revoked on the basis that Lady Mordaunt's insanity was not a bar to proceedings. The laws had not changed, and it looked like the court was doing Sir Charles a favour. Finally, in 1875, Sir Charles got his divorce on the grounds of his wife's adultery and subsequent child with Lord Cole. Cole never contested the action. Was the finding of insanity, as some newspapers claimed, a means to silence Harriet? And why did Sir Charles's lawyers never question the Prince of Wales fully in court? And what about Lowry Cole's paternal concession? Did he believe himself the father, or was he paid off by a member of the royal family? Sir Charles would never see Harriet again, and he remarried 3 years later in 1878 to Mary Cholmondeley, the daughter of a vicar. The finding of insanity gave rise to suspicions that there was a conspiracy to silence Lady Mordaunt. One newspaper, for example, asked why the prince, being a young married man, should have been so eager to pay weekly visits to a young married woman when her husband was absent, if it was all so innocent. There is some evidence that the establishment closed ranks at a time when Republican sympathies in Britain and Ireland had been aroused by Queen Victoria's virtual withdrawal from public life. It seems that, in advance of the trial, the prince's household received private assurances that his position would be protected as far as possible, and some years later his private secretary, Francis Knollys, recalled that the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, had been involved indirectly but successfully behind the scenes. The whole affair could have damaged the prince's reputation in the eyes of the middle and lower classes. Queen Victoria seems to have been convinced of her son's innocence regarding Lady Mordaunt, and remained staunch in his defence, but was nonetheless deeply hurt by the affair. So what befell Harriet? If there was any positive outcome for her, it was that her social and financial status allowed for private asylum care, which was far better than the overcrowded, non-hygienic, abusive atmosphere of most public institutions at the time. Even so, she would spend the rest of her days locked away. Records of the census of 1871 reveal that she was living on the western outskirts of London, at the Manor House Asylum in Chiswick, whose clinical director was Thomas Tuke, who was at the time one of the most respected practitioners in lunacy care, and, together with the Prince of Wales's physician, William Gull, played a prominent role in the Mordaunt case. In evidence to the court, Tuke had been clear in his assertion that Harriet was suffering from insanity regarding her confessions of serial adultery with several men up to a few weeks before the birth of her daughter, as typical delusions associated with that condition. 6 years later, in 1877, she was moved from Chiswick to Hayes Park Private Asylum in Hillingdon. The census of 1881 shows she was still there, and was described as a boarder, along with several other patients of aristocratic title. 10 years later, the census shows that she was at a private residence known as Hampton Lee, Langley Park Road in Sutton in Surrey. Her name now abbreviated to the initials HSM, as was the accepted practice for those afflicted by lunacy. It is noted that her place of birth is incorrectly given as West Sussex. She also appears to have had an attendant with her. 10 years later, she was still in Surrey. Her name now shown as Harriet Morgan, with the same incorrect place of birth, and described as a widow, probably a reference to the death of Sir Charles, her former husband, in 1897. It seems that she no longer comes under the Lunacy Act, as her name is now fully entered, but she is shown as being feeble-minded. Harriet died in May 1906 at the age of 58, after spending 2/3 of her life, 37 years, locked away from sight, and she is buried at Brompton Cemetery. The daughter, Violet, lived at Moncrieff House in Scotland after her mother's detention at Chiswick. Sir Charles appears to have taken no direct interest in her, although he did make provision for her maintenance as part of a wider settlement after his divorce that included also a sum towards Lady Mordaunt's care. In 1890, Violet married Viscount Weymouth, later 5th Marquess of Bath. Neither her mother nor Sir Charles were present at the wedding, and, despite his continual refusal to acknowledge Violet, Sir Charles appears to have been offended by the Moncrieff's decision not to invite him. There is some evidence that, at Christmas the previous year, Harriet, by then referred to as Miss Moncrieff, was allowed out of detention to meet her future son-in-law. Violet died in 1928. Her son Henry, the 6th Marquess of Bath, became famous in the 1960s for developing a safari park at the family estate at Longleat in Wiltshire.